The Economist.
Hello and welcome to The Intelligence from The Economist. I'm Jason Palmer.
And I'm Rosie Blore. Every weekday we provide a fresh perspective on the events shaping your world.
As if there isn't enough to worry about, consider the prospect of nuclear war in space. The first casualties would be the satellites that keep so much earthly business going. We examine the risks and how some firms are aiming to mitigate them.
And every week this summer, we're answering your questions about artificial intelligence. I definitely didn't know the answer to this one, but don't worry, I didn't ask ChatGPT. I found a brilliant human colleague instead. But first, mpox, or monkeypox as it used to be known, is a highly contagious disease endemic in remote areas of West and Central Africa. Though there have been outbreaks before, a new strain of mpox is now spreading, which is both more dangerous and more contagious than earlier ones. Since January, tens of thousands of cases have been reported, and nearly 3,000 people have died from the disease, according to Africa Centers for Disease Control. The World Health Organization has declared mpox a public health emergency of international concern.
It's clear that a coordinated international response is essential to stop these outbreaks and save lives.
Though last night it also said that we don't have a new pandemic on our hands. But the disease has already appeared outside Africa. Can mpox really be brought under control and contained?
Mpox is a viral infection from a family of poxes, and it was discovered first in animals but then in humans over 50 years ago. It causes a severe fever, aching, and a rash of these pus-filled blisters that start on the face and then spread lower down the body. And in the most severe cases, it can be deadly.
Ore Ogunbi is The Economist Africa correspondent.
So the virus has actually been endemic in some West African countries since 2017. And even though it was originally transmitted from animals to humans zoonotically, it can now also be transmitted between humans. And this latest outbreak, which is mostly due to a new strain, is worse than what's been seen before.
So in what way is it worse? What's different this time?
So this new strain that they're calling Clade 1b is more dangerous than in previous outbreaks because, let me try and explain. There are two types of mpox, so think about it like two big branches on a tree. Clade 1, which we've always known to be a bit more severe, and Clade 2. And then those clades then have subclades. So the 2022 outbreak that reached the West was mostly of Clade 2. But this strain that we're seeing move around the Democratic Republic of Congo is a subset of Clade 1 called Clade 1b. So I spoke with Dr. Cheryl Walter, who studies mpox at the University of Hull Medical School.
It's a lot more serious. It results in serious disease and, most importantly, higher case fatality rates.
Now, it's early days, so there are still lots of unknowns, but what we do know is it only seems to be transmitting between humans as well. So that means that it transmits faster than if it was from animals.
It's passing from person to person very, very frequently, which is concerning. So it doesn't necessarily need that reservoir of animal anymore.
Since January, there have been more than 22,000 suspected cases and more than 1,200 deaths reported. But the numbers vary a lot because it's not easy to confirm all these cases, especially in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And as the virus has moved through people, it's continuing to mutate. And worryingly, most of the recorded cases in the Congo so far have been children.
And where else is the virus spreading now?
So the Congo's neighbours towards the east, so for example, Burundi, Rwanda, Uganda and Kenya are now reporting cases of mpox. And for context, mpox has never been recorded there before. And in reality, the number of cases are probably higher than the estimates that we're reporting because there's just limited surveillance of who actually has the disease. But 95% of the confirmed ones so far are in the Congo. I've been speaking with a health worker there, Dr. Alice Mundakareza. She says that as people are living with its scars, there's lots of fear as people are seeing how this rash looks on pierced, pox-marked skin. But then again, people don't know what to do if it shows up on them, especially if they've never seen it before. And now, because the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo is actually embroiled in a regional conflict at the moment, the disease is spreading really fast in crowded displacement camps where it's obviously difficult to isolate. And then it's crossing the border to neighbouring countries as well, and even further afield to Europe.
We've seen mpox in Europe quite recently in 2022, and there was a very successful vaccination campaign to get rid of it. Is that likely to work this time?
So yeah, in the 2022 outbreak, a vaccine that was originally designed for smallpox was actually used to contain most of it when it reached the West. Even though it wasn't specifically designed for mpox, smallpox is close enough that immunity-wise, it offers you enough cross-protection. But we're going to need a lot more of the vaccines, especially in Africa, than we currently have. The whole continent of Africa needs more than 50 times what it currently has. So I spoke with an expert named Dr. Dimye Ogona at the World Health Organization, who's chairing the emergency committee on the resurgence of mpox.
So I've always said it's really unfortunate that it took a global outbreak for us to start emergency use authorization, compassionate use, and even licensing of mpox vaccines. And that's because it was a disease that was neglected in Africa. Mpox has been with us 54 years. And it's actually shameful to all of us that we waited for the 2022 outbreak before we started working on vaccines.
I think part of the frustration is that research into an mpox-specific vaccine could be so much further ahead if the disease hadn't been neglected for most of its 50-odd-year existence.
And in that regard, has the WHO pushed for more vaccinations to be made? I mean, could we see another international effort like we did with COVID to get vaccines into Africa?
So the big declarations made by organizations like the Africa CDC, calling it a public health emergency of continental security, and the World Health Organization calling it one of international concern, they actually unlock a lot of ring-fenced funding that can then be used for surveillance and testing and should help fast-track some of the protocols around vaccine approvals. So that should get things to the continent faster. You've also got agencies like UNICEF and Gavi who are working on getting more vaccines into the region. And help is coming from individual countries as well, like Japan, but also Europe is donating some. And because the smallpox vaccine used to be a thing that people got, most people in the West over about the age of 45 probably have some protection from mpox. But the challenge is there's less natural immunity for the young because the smallpox jab is no longer compulsory. Our collective immunity as a population has worn away over time. So in the most effective region, so back to the Congo, where lots of children are malnourished or they're behind on their other regular jabs, or potentially battling other diseases. So there's a cholera outbreak, there's a measles outbreak. Kids there are especially vulnerable. So this is different to COVID when the worry was about the elderly. This time, it's the children.
And I guess the big question is, could it be similar to COVID in other ways? Could this become another global pandemic?
Well, the World Health Organization has said it's not the new COVID because countries know how to control it. The threat is real, though, and potentially global, because there are still so many unknowns about how this new strain of mpox moves. We don't have good controlled studies of it, and even in Africa, where it's been for many years, it's gone relatively understudied. As it moves around through humans, it may continue to mutate, and it could get a lot more widespread. But we have not reached pandemic levels. All the international organizations are coming together and doing the right things, but we're back in this position where diseases that only affect poor countries, like mpox has for African countries for so long, don't start mattering until they also affect rich countries and hit Europe. And so for as long as that mentality is still the norm, emerging rare diseases will continue to pose very real global risks.
Ora, thank you so much. Great to talk to you. Great to have you back on the show.
Thanks for having me, Rosie.
I think people underestimate the importance of satellites, not just for military matters, but also for the operation of civilian infrastructure.
Benjamin Sutherland writes about security and technology for The Economist.
And they are quite vulnerable to attack.
In what way are they vulnerable to attack?
For years or decades, people have worried about various anti-satellite weapons, missiles being shot up from Earth, or various types of lasers, pellet guns, ways to knock out satellites. Well, now there's growing fears that Russia is planning to put a nuclear weapon right at the top of what's known as low Earth orbit, and that would hold a large number of satellites at dramatic risk.
In the sense that they would just get blown out of the sky or blown out of space?
If you had a nuclear detonation in space, and that's actually the right term, it wouldn't be a blast. When you're in the vacuum of space, you don't have a fireball or a shock wave. But the nuclear detonation would create a huge surge of radiation and highly charged particles. This is known as an electromagnetic pulse, or an EMP. And what would happen is that EMP, when it goes through a satellite, would switch on all the transistors and the microchips all at once. You would have a surge of power from the hardware's power supply battery system, and that would actually fry the chips.
So it's not the electromagnetic pulse then that does it, but rather the satellite's own power. But this does not, in any case, sound like a precision strike.
Yes, it would be 100% indiscriminate. Any satellites in range would be hit, and then you'd also have storms of radiation that would move through orbits for weeks or months after that. And so even satellites that were on the other side of the Earth when the detonation took place would eventually be moving through these radiation belts, and that would cause problems with their electronics too. So it would just be a bloodbath in orbit, if you will.
Okay, and it's fears that Russia is developing a weapon that can do this that sparked all this worry.
Well, American intelligence agencies appear to have known something about this for a certain period of time, but the news really started to break in February. The administration was trying to keep it quiet, perhaps for diplomatic leverage to work on the issue, but alarm felt by various political and defense leaders in February started leading to leaks.
So is there anything that can be done, any way to protect satellites from that risk?
Actually, there is, and since it's not a shockwave which is destroying the satellites, it's this electromagnetic pulse and associated radiation. If you can shut a satellite down before the brunt of that EMP arrives, you prevent the voltage from the power supply moving through and frying the circuitry. So if you have warning of the incoming EMP and can shut the system down in time, it will have a pretty good chance of surviving. So people are working on developing better systems to actually detect the incoming EMP pulse and shut circuitry down just in time. And so there's a type of device known as a nuclear event detector. It's actually a microchip assembly. And what it does is it detects the signature, if you will, gamma radiation right at the beginning before it builds up to a dangerous level, and then immediately sends out kind of a here it comes signal to shut down power across the system, and that can happen in just about 15 nanoseconds.
So it sounds like for new satellites that go up with those kinds of detectors in, then the problem is solved. That's it.
Well, there's another problem, actually. Even after an EMP, satellites that survive that still have to deal with fierce radiation fields known as belts. And these get kind of pumped up or amped up with radiation from the nuclear blast. So estimates are that you could have 3 orders of magnitude or even 4 orders of magnitude more radiation following a nuclear blast than the natural cosmic background levels of radiation. Now, that's meaningful. If you have a satellite that's designed to last for a decade to be able to withstand that much radiation before it starts breaking down, and you have 3 orders of magnitude more radiation, that satellite will die within 3 or 4 days. So it's dramatic, and you have all sorts of companies and labs working on various ways to do what they call radiation hardening or rad hardening of components. But that gets harder and harder as componentry and microchips get smaller, faster, more sophisticated. The guys who are working on this complain that every time there's an advance with better, faster componentry, they have to design new techniques or come up with new strategies. And it just gets harder and harder. So that's another problem.
Well, what about going after the cause rather than after the effects of the problem here and attempting to prevent these nuclear events from happening in space at all?
Sure. So one approach would be to find such a satellite, identify it, and because potentially, if you find the satellite with a nuclear weapon in it, you could jam it or disable it or use some sort of countermeasure against it. But that wouldn't necessarily be easy. There are about 10,000 active satellites up there, a lot of defunct satellites, thousands more going up. So you have to be able to find any kind of weaponized satellite in this huge field, if you will, of objects flying through low Earth orbit. And so DARPA, Pentagon Advanced Projects Research Agency, has provided funding to a California company known as Slingshot Aerospace. And they've been developing AI systems to try and detect what they call outliers or any satellites that might actually be weaponized, and be it with a nuclear weapon or some other type of weapon system. And that software looks at all kinds of orbital data from a network of sensor stations around the world, all kinds of databases looking for clues that this satellite is reflecting light differently, this satellite is making more orbital maneuvers and therefore may be heavier and needing more adjustments to maintain its orbit than a lighter satellite, that kind of thing.
So it's in that sense another defense cat and mouse game, but this time going on in space, and really quite a lot of countries are facing this risk.
Yeah, in theory, Russia could be subjected to massive international pressure. I'd say that if Russia is allowed to put a nuclear weapon in orbit, it's going to make a mockery of the 1967 United Nations Outer Space Treaty. Now, of course, America may have the most to lose, but everybody uses space, and so this is going to be the world's problem too.
Benjamin, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.
While some of us are worrying about nukes in space, others are worrying about space itself, specifically whether we understand the substances that make it up. If you've got no idea what I'm talking about, you'd better listen to Babbage, our science podcast. The first of 2 episodes, Cosmology in Crisis, aired last week, and the second goes out today. You'll need to be a subscriber to listen. Sign up now for a month's free trial to Economist Podcast Plus. Artificial intelligence is sweeping the world. The tools we use are becoming more and more intelligent, and for some of us, more and more confusing. To help you keep up, every week this summer, we're answering your questions about AI. Last week, we looked at facial recognition. Today's question is in very different terrain.
Hi, I'm Mitchell DePani from Waltham, Massachusetts. My question is, what are the energy demands of AI? And are countries around the world prepared to meet those demands alongside the goals of a clean energy transition?
To answer Mitchell's question on energy demand, we turned to Vijay Vaitaswaran, The Economist's Global Energy and Climate Innovation Editor.
Well, that's a great question, Mitchell. You're quite right that artificial intelligence, which requires huge servers to churn out enormous amounts of data, takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot more energy to make AI-based search than a typical Google search, for example. And the uses are proliferating. So we've all seen the headlines that this is going to create a major energy crisis of some kind. It's certainly true that the big tech companies are making massive investments in these AI data centers on the order of tens of billions of dollars every quarter. Just to give an example, in the first quarter of this year, $40 billion were spent by the big tech companies, most of it in data centers for AI. And these aren't the small-scale data centers of the past, of cloud computing. These are much bigger, much more energy-intensive kind of data centers. And it's not as if they started from a low base either. The big four companies, Alphabet, AWS, Meta, and Microsoft, they already consume 90 terawatt hours of electricity in 2022, as much as the entire country of Colombia. But since then, it's skyrocketing. When we look at the numbers, we can see that based on the best projections from the International Energy Agency and other forecasters, the energy consumption from big tech and data centers looks set to double from 2022 to 2026. So it is a significant increase. Now, that sounds like a lot of energy, but I think this omelet has been a bit over-egged. I think countries will be able to cope with the challenge. Even allowing for the spike in AI demand, the total consumption from these data centers will still only make up a small share of global power consumption. S&P, one of the companies that analyzes this area, thinks that by 2030, AI will make up only about 3 to 4% of total power demand. So we have to keep this in perspective. Now, there is a legitimate related challenge. It's not that the world won't have enough energy to handle AI. It's that in a world where we have accelerating climate change and there are commitments to net zero emissions, to triple renewables, for example, as a share of total energy, it's reasonable to ask whether this immediate, urgent demand for a lot more power for AI could throw countries off their climate commitments.
World leaders at the UN Climate Summit have just reached an agreement. This comes after a marathon of intense negotiations.
And siphon off energy for this new use, when in fact the grid already was short on renewable energy and clean power for other uses. And we do see some evidence that in some parts of the world, utilities are reflexively just turning to natural gas plants as an easy and familiar way to meet that growing power demand. Why? Because they know how to do it. They're big. The engineers that run them are quite familiar with how to connect them. Sometimes it can be a little bit more effort to build lots of new solar or connect them with batteries and manage the intermittency. So we're seeing a tendency in some places just to put on more dirty power in order to meet the AI load. What's interesting is that the big tech companies, which have made commitments to net zero, in the case of Microsoft, they've even promised to go negative. That is, they'll take out more carbon emissions than they've consumed in their entire lifetime, is their commitment.
By 2030, Microsoft will be carbon negative.
So they're pushing back against utilities that simply want to add dirty power to the grid to meet their load. And they've walked away from regions where that was the plan that the utilities had. So they want what's called clean, firm power. This could be met by renewables plus some form of energy storage. They've even made novel deals to contract for carbon-free nuclear power, giving that technology a lease on life, which is consistent with climate goals since it doesn't emit greenhouse gases. There's another area where I'm hopeful. It's not just that we're going to see a kickstart to clean energy from the companies promoting the AI boom. It's that AI itself is actually a double-edged sword. Yes, we'll use more of it, and that requires energy, but we can clean up that energy. But the energy that's used to produce the data, as it were, can itself be made more efficient, including by applying AI in these data centers for a much more efficient data center design. A huge amount of the energy in these data centers actually goes to cooling, and much more thought's being given how to design these data centers in a way that would use a lot less energy for cooling, maybe even time shifting, for example, when data is processed or when queries are solved, or geography shifting based on if the grid is about to overload and you need to turn on some dirty coal plants. Well, maybe you can delay your training data for a few hours until we get a lower point on the grid. And all these things are being optimized by AI itself. So I actually see a huge wave of efficiency, including in the very chips that are used from NVIDIA, for example, to make this search much more efficient. And so I see an opportunity here for leapfrogging. In conclusion, I'd say, yes, AI's energy demands can be met. They're going to be a lot. And at the margin, in certain places, they're going to push some grids towards either overload or turning to the easiest source of power. But I think on balance, if we plan this properly and dig for those efficiency gains, I think AI will actually be a net win for the climate.
We'll be discussing AI again next week, so please send us any burning questions you have on the topic to podcasts@economist.com. That's all for this episode of The Intelligence. Let us know what you think of the show. You can get in touch at podcast@economist.com. We'll see you back here tomorrow.